Welcome to Power Hour. I'm Alex Epstein. This week is going to be a best of Power Hour for a couple reasons. One is I'm recording at least one new Power Hour in the next week. It's with the climate economist Richard Tol. We had an interesting exchange on Twitter where he was critical of something that I said about energy prices. And we disagreed, but he happily agreed to come on the podcast to discuss it and also some of his other views. He's a very interesting guy, very, prominent climate economist who challenges a lot of academic catastrophism. So while I disagree with him on a lot of things, I think he's an interesting guy and his viewpoint is definitely worth hearing. So excited about that. Also trying to get one of my favorite figures in African energy to come talk about the Paris Climate Accords, and hopefully me even talking about it here, pressures him to come on, or rather not just the Paris Climate Accords, but rather the continuation of that, which is the upcoming what's called COP26 in Glasgow, which starts at the very beginning of November. So got a bunch of other things planned, so that's part of why I'm not having a new episode. But the other reason is because I was thinking about it, and there was an episode early this year that I think was prophetic, and I think it's really worth rehearing in the context of what's happened. And this is my interview with the energy economist Michael Lynch. Now, for those of you who are familiar with this program throughout its history, Mike first came on the show. It was either the second or third episode. And he made a prediction about oil prices that back then seemed impossible because oil prices were around $100 at the time. And he said, no, like it's going to be, $30, $50, $70 in that kind of range. And that just seemed like, no, of course, oil prices are going to go up back then. But he was right about that. And he's generally more right than anyone I know in this field. And yet lots of people who make totally wrong predictions are they're much more prominent than Mike is. Not that he's not well respected, but people like Amory Lovins, lots of different catastrophists, they just are totally wrong all the time. And there's no price to pay. And in particular, there were a lot of people wrong early this year saying, well, post-pandemic, oil is just going to stay low. Of course, it had declined during the pandemic lockdown. It's going to stay low. It's going to decline. We're at peak oil demand. And now that has not happened at all, and the world is experiencing big shortages of fossil fuels for reasons I'll be discussing and debating with, those issues with Richard Tol next week. And I think it's really clear that these people who predicted peak oil demand were just wrong. And I think it's really valuable to listen to that interview and discussion with Mike to see what his reasoning was, as well as what my reasoning was at the time, because I think we were very much vindicated. And while the people who made the wrong predictions haven't done much soul searching or any, as far as I can tell, I think it's useful to see, okay, who was actually right and what reasons did they give and what kind of methodology did they use? So you could call that self-aggrandizing, but I think I'll just call it educational. And had I made those wrong predictions, I promise you I would have been very concerned about it and discussed it publicly. All right, so I really hope you enjoy this episode. Before we go into it, I'll say something about this at the end as well, but I just want to announce, because I haven't mentioned it on Power Hour yet, because I don't think it existed last Power Hour, that I have a new newsletter under Substack, which is the popular new newsletter, and it's free. It's the Energy Talking Points newsletter. And I think this is going to take Energy Talking Points to the next level because it's going to give you the latest talking points in a very current fashion. I think we've published about 8 of them so far. They're pretty short, so you can read through them in a few minutes and really get to the bottom of issues or get on top of issues, depending on how, let's just say get on top of issues. And then it's at least the beginning of getting to the bottom of them, in part because there are a lot of references in these. So check that out. It's at alexepstein.substack.com. And please share this with others. This is a free resource. We're really at a crucial point in energy history. We've got this horrific reconciliation bill being promoted in the US. We've got this horrific climate conference internationally. We've got this energy crisis that's really showcasing the failures of green energy. This is the time for everyone to be armed. And so this resource is, it's free, and I can distribute. There's no limit on how many I can send out because Substack has unlimited distribution. So please make use of it. Also, I just announced in my regular, more personal newsletter that to incentivize people to share it, if you can get 10 people to subscribe, I'll give you a free 1-year paid subscription to Substack. So basically, Most of the writing in Energy Talking Points is totally free, but if you pay, you get access to certain things like discussion forums that others don't get access to. You get the ability to comment. I will probably be offering full transcripts, really good transcripts of Power Hour in the future, but that doesn't exist yet. But if you do want that a subscription and you want to get it free, I would prefer that you found me 10 new subscribers versus paying for it. Because for me, Substack is not, I'm not planning on it being like a money generating thing. I have other ways of making money. I want it to be, I want 100,000 people plus on this. And I'm totally happy if none of them are paying. So if you can get 10 people to subscribe, you'll get a free year paid subscription. If you can get 100 people to subscribe, I will give you a personalized signed copy of Fossil Future, which now has a cover, which I'll show very soon. I think it's a really cool cover. I spent a lot of time going back and forth with the designer to make it as good as I wanted. So also, I think the book is good. So free, you'll get a personalized signed copy of that. And if somebody can find 1,000 subscribers, then I will give a virtual speech and Q&A to whatever organization you want. So hopefully that's incentive. As for how to verify that, if you can get people to agree and you can show that they've agreed, you can just send me a spreadsheet with the names and I can put them in. Otherwise, you'll have to find some clever way of just directing them to alexepstein.substack.com and validating that you directed at least approximately that many people signed up. It's not going to be totally scientific, maybe, but I just want the basic incentive. So again, this is I think a hugely valuable resource for everyone. And I just want to encourage I want to incentivize everyone to spread it as much as possible, as quickly as possible. All right. Well, now that I went into all of that, I was planning on doing an outro to the show, but I really don't need to do an outro since I've already said so much. So just the usual reminders. If you have any questions, comments, love mail, or hate mail, email me at alex@alexepstein.com. And yeah, I think the most important thing is that Energy Talking Points Substack. So again, it is alexepstein.substack.com. All right. Enjoy the discussion with Michael Lynch.
Power Hour, because what you don't know about energy can kill you. Here's Alex Epstein.
Welcome to Power Hour. I'm Alex Epstein. Well, this is my second episode in the week of this Texas electricity crisis, and I'm going to ask my guest a little bit about this, but mainly we're going to talk about something longer term, which is the future of oil. Now, the first time I had this guest in my podcast, everyone was claiming we would be running out of oil. Now they're claiming we have too much oil and we'll have no use for it. Both times he is criticizing the mainstream opinion, and I suspect both times he is right. My guest is Michael Lynch. Michael, welcome to Power Hour.
Thanks a lot, Alex. Good to see you.
Good to have you back. You were the second guest ever in Power Hour history, and I sometimes tell Robert Bryce this because he was the first. But when I had you on, I thought I'll never get this guy on my podcast. It was very intimidating at the time. So
no,
good to have gotten to know you since then.
Yes,
I'm not as starstruck.
Yeah,
and him as well. So let's before we talk about, so you have a new essay that I think is really good, but let's talk about a little bit what's happening in Texas. So what's your high level take on this?
My high level take is that partly this is an unusual situation. We have seen this throughout in the energy security business, which is people don't like to spend money on insurance for small probability events like unusual weather events. People in Massachusetts, after an ice storm, said, why don't we bury the power lines until they heard what it costs? I know there's been problems with natural gas supply and power plants, but also wind turbines freezing up. And amazingly enough, solar power doesn't work too well when the panels are covered with snow. So, I think this is a problem where you have, partly because you have people pushing certain mandates to satisfy objectives that may not reflect the real needs of the system. In particular, pushing a lot of renewables, which are, as we all know, they're very volatile, they're variable, they're unpredictable, they require a lot of backup. But it's also, people want cheap electricity. And if you say, do you want to pay us, to have winterized plants and pumps and so forth, they don't want to hear about that.
Well, and also, I mean, one point I made I posted this Twitter thread that has become at least by far the most popular thing I've ever posted. I mean, one point, and we had this in California as well, is the more you're spending extra for what I would call unreliable energy, when you're putting cost pressure already, the less people are inclined to do things like maintenance and reliability, because then it's even more of a burden to the ratepayers. I think it's documented in California that there were talks of PG&E doing a whole bunch of maintenance, and they basically said, look, we're spending all this money extra for green energy. There's going to be a lot of hostility to this if we raise the rates and we do this. So these things have trade-offs, and I definitely think that's a part of it. But let's jump into the future more. So first of all, just give the readers, I have a bunch of specific questions of what's your essay, and then what's your summary of it?
Well, essentially, in the past couple of years, people have started talking about peak oil demand, and the pandemic has increased the idea that it's imminent or even past. You've had a few companies like BP and Shell that have scenarios that show a near-term peak in oil demand, and it's kind of the flavor of the day. Everybody wants to talk about it, and the problem is, it's most of the talk is very superficial. The assumption that somehow human nature is going to change because of the pandemic, even though nothing has ever changed it before. And there's a lot of bad numbers when you talk about, especially battery electric vehicles. I found all kinds of things where people, they should have already taken over the market by now, and instead they're 2%, 3% of the market. And I think a lot of it is just irrational exuberance.
And what was the title again?
Oh, the title was Oil Demand After the Pandemic, Is the End in Sight? I think that was it.
Gotcha.
I haven't read it in a while.
Yeah, I just read it, but I forgot the title, but I remember the content. Yeah. So one thing I like about your work in general is that you like to draw historical parallels to predictions about the future. I think there's just a generally huge bias when apparently smart people are predicting things with confidence, to treat them as if these predictions are real, as if, oh, well, they're saying this, so it has to happen. The world, everyone's saying we're going to net zero by 2050. So we are really doing that. Or Biden says we're going carbon-free electricity grid by 2035. So that's really happening. And with these green predictions, technologically, specifically, you have a couple of ones that I found fascinating historically. So one I'd like you to talk about a bit is Amory Lovin's supercar.
This was it's funny because he came up with the idea of the supercar or hypercar about the same time as the Clinton administration was pushing the same idea, but from a slightly different angle. And his argument was, oh, you can make a really, really efficient car that gets 80, 90, 100 miles per gallon. And, you could, but it required a cost of something like $120,000 for a vehicle. And he said, this is, he later wrote a report, Winning the Oil Endgame. And he said, oh, this hyper efficient car plus cellulosic ethanol means that, we're all going to stop using oil.
I didn't realize he was peddling that at one point.
What's actually more amazing is you can find it on the web, download it, and he has all these top flight people, including senior oil industry executives and George Shultz, who's an economist, praising the report. Apparently, I don't think they actually read it very carefully, but they don't seem to realize that Amory Lovins has been sort of telling us, energy is efficiency is too cheap to meter, and he keeps predicting electricity demand will collapse, and then with this report, gasoline demand will collapse, and the stuff doesn't come through because he just completely ignores costs. He's totally uninterested in the cost of all these things. If they're technically feasible, he says we will do it.
What about fuel cell predictions?
Yeah, this is funny because I've been looking at this again. 25 years ago, Ballard Power said, oh, we've made a cheaper fuel cell. And people went gaga over it, to use a technical term. The economist wrote about how, this was the next big thing. Daimler Chrysler said, oh, by 2004, 2005, we'll be selling 100,000 hydrogen fuel cell vehicles a year. Current sales now are about 2,000. The auto companies poured hundreds of millions of dollars into this. The Ballard Power stock went from about $1 to $120 and back down again. And it was never close to feasible, but I've been pulling up all these great stories about the hydrogen fuel cell bus in Chicago is the next big thing and so forth. And it just didn't play out because it was just wildly uneconomic, and it still is.
All right, one more, which we alluded to, cellulosic ethanol. I think Vinod Khosla once called this brain dead simple or something like that.
Yeah. This is astonishing because I've seen so many people talk about how, this is it's so easy, it's right there. And Congress actually wound up mandating that the oil industry buy a certain amount of cellulosic ethanol, not just ethanol, but cellulosic ethanol per year. And the industry, the companies just said, look, we can't get the chemistry right. The cell molecular bonds are just too hard to break. We can do it, but it's super expensive. The other thing people kind of ignored was, they sort of go, oh, well, you're not using corn, you're using waste mass, like what's left after you take out the corn feed, the corn from the corn stalks. But you have to transport all that stuff to a plant. And so it's not free. It's actually kind of expensive. And you've had any number of people who sort of touted this. James Woolsey, the former CIA director, wrote a foreign affairs article, again, about 25 years ago. And it supposedly is right around the corner, and it's just not there.
So when you bring these things up in the essay, I think you make the good point that this doesn't prove that new predictions are wrong, but it means that it's not proven that they're right. So we need to look at them critically. And one piece of context that you give that I hadn't thought much about, but I find fascinating, is this idea that it's very rare that resources go out of use. You say sometimes they'll peak, but it's rare that they go out of use. And you use the examples of wood and stone. So I'd love you to talk about that.
Well, the famous quote is the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stone. And the truth is, people stopped using stone tools. They switched to bronze and then iron and now steel. But stone is still a big business. There's only about 50 years of data for crushed stone use, for example, in this country, and it's basically hasn't gone down at all. People still use wood about as much as they ever did. The power, the U.S. power system uses a substantial amount of wood. It's mostly in cogeneration plants, and it hasn't gone down. Again, it's been relatively flat for 40 or 50 years. So these things just don't go away. What usually happens is they stop growing and something else takes over the growth, like oil took over from coal up to a point. I mean, global coal usage is still near record highs.
So what is the explanation for this? Why don't they go away?
Well, it's usually a question of, partly inertia. You have all this installed capital that's designed to use it. It's usually fairly attractive in the use that it's put. You don't see the economics go that bad, or it remains, say, a niche market. So nobody uses gas for lighting in their houses anymore, but there's still lots of gas use because it's there, it's cheap, and it has other uses. I mean, I don't think as you say, most of us don't use animal fat to lubricate our machines, but I guess a lot of us use it on our bodies. So I shouldn't use that as an example.
Yeah, it is really interesting. Like once you figure out how to cost effectively produce something, that's such a feat. And then people can just find all these valuable uses for it.
Yeah, and if people stop using wood, to heat all their homes, then all of a sudden you've got a lot of wood out there that's going unused. And some people say, well, I live near a forest, I'll use heat. I just saw a story that England is suffering pollution because of so many people are burning wood. And my old mentor, Maury Edelman, used to say that the Pilgrims came to Boston to get warm, and people would laugh because Boston's so cold. But he said, but the wood was so cheap, people had roaring fires.
Wow, that's fascinating. Okay, so now we're going to move to oil. And so oil is interesting because oil is the most valuable material in the world, and it's predicted to be so worthless that to have it on your inventory means that it's a stranded asset. So it's a really interesting kind of prediction. And one piece of context, if we start off with the battery vehicle thing, is you talk about what it means. You do oil vehicles versus battery vehicles. Before we get to that, you give this really good comparison of what it really means to be superior. And you use the example of the Model T versus the horse. So talk about that kind of competitive advantage that the Model T had over the horse.
So the Model T was the first mass production car, and it quickly took over the automobile market and just, transportation ultimately. And some people have said, oh, Tesla is the Model T of the future, or the present, I guess. The truth is, a Model T could carry 5 to 7 passengers. It had a range of a couple hundred miles. It could easily do 30 miles, 40 miles an hour. There was the emissions went into the air, so you didn't have to deal with them. Whereas a horse, you could do maybe 12 miles an hour for limited periods. You could go carry 1 to 2 people. You could only carry about 10% as much cargo on a horse as you could in a Model T. And the Model T was more expensive, but in every other factor, it was far superior to the horse. Whereas if you look at a battery electric vehicle, they're a lot more expensive. They have much smaller range. Plus, the range is really uncertain, which is not a problem with gasoline vehicles. And the recharging time, the absolute best recharging time is still 5 times as much as it takes to refuel a gasoline car. And it can be 10 and 20 if you don't have access to a fast charging station.
I mean, one interesting thing when it comes to the vehicles, this relates to a bunch of other things, but talk about the trend of SUVs around the world. Because one of the attractions of the battery vehicles is in people's minds, people think they're saving the world, so they're going to do that in mass. But it seems like people are using a lot of SUVs.
Yeah, that's the funny thing. I was a little surprised to see, even in countries like India, the market share of SUVs has tripled in 10 years. And it's approaching that in the US. The SUV people want comfort. They want capability. They don't want green. I mean, people always brag about, oh, look how many electric cars are being sold, but the SUV is far outpacing the electric cars. And it kind of goes. I think you could go back to Plato and the idea of, the spiritual world is so much superior than the material world. Some people will tell you. And most famously, you had hermits and anchorites in the Middle Ages who would lock themselves up in cells so they could avoid the material world and think. And now you have people say, oh, consumers don't really want stuff. It's like, really, how come they're all buying all this stuff? I don't see any sign. There's like 0.5% of people say, oh, I want to live a simple life, and the rest of the people want to have electrically heated car seats. So there's no real push because of morality or social concerns away from the consumption of fossil fuels and trying to reduce emissions in that sense.
I mean, you make a lot of good points in the essay about the specific details of the cost, like the cost effectiveness of battery vehicles for the average person, both the cost and the effectiveness. And one thing that I've been thinking about a lot as I finish my second book is I don't trust people to predict the future unless they recognize the present. And and I do it with climate, like if people don't admit climate deaths have gone down, or if they don't admit that fossil fuels are dominant, I don't believe anything they say about the future. And it's similar with battery vehicles, where if people say, yes, battery vehicles are not yet nearly as cost effective as fossil fuels, but for X, Y, and Z, I think they will be, that's plausible. But a lot of people act like, oh no, they're way better now for the average person. And that's just totally detached from reality, right?
Yeah, I actually just recently found there's 2 different groups at MIT that have estimated the competitiveness of gasoline versus battery cars. And one group, which is engineers, said, oh, they're all already much better than gasoline powered cars. And the economist said, well, if you factor in stuff like convenience, no, you need to get a lot better off. It really bothers me because you have a lot of assertions made out there about what people want. And then you have all these excuses for why people don't seem to understand what they should want, like market failures and bad information and social costs and so forth. But in the end, it comes down to you make a better product, people buy it, and the electric car is nowhere near a better product at this point.
Let's talk about batteries and the evidence for that, because you do have, I mean, as far as I can tell, a very impressive drop in the price of batteries of lithium ion batteries, at least in the last decade. So, how far has that gone, and where do you see it going?
Well, that's something I didn't include it in this report. I did it several years ago. I found that the numbers are very fuzzy, because if you go back more than 4 or 5 years, there was not a mass market for these batteries. So the cost estimates also range very widely, and people's estimates of the trend in cost declining are like 10% to 25% a year, and so forth. So it's not clear how far they've come down. They are cheaper, they are better. On the other hand, when you say, okay, so if the battery pack is a big part of the car's cost, how come the price of cars hasn't come down? So the Nissan Leaf, which is the one that's been sold for some years, the prices haven't gone down at all, even though the battery pack has come down supposedly about $5,000. So we don't know how much further you're going to get with the lithium-ion battery, because it is starting to become a mature technology now, which 10 years ago it definitely was not. And it's not clear it's going to get that much better. There are people talking about new types of batteries, but none of them is well. And there are people who've been talking about other batteries just around the corner, like nickel metal hydride, sodium sulfate, which just didn't pan out. So it's not clear to me that you can really predict that the price of the battery is going to be that much lower to offset all these other problems, like the long charging times.
Yeah, I'm really interested to see how it plays out, because I've noticed the same thing with the actual price of these vehicles. It hasn't been plummeting as much as you would think, and there's this view, I think, that, I mean, everything is a false analogy to microchips. I think that's a lot of it. So everyone is just like, oh, well, Moore's law happens, and so that's got to happen.
Yeah.
And it's weird to think of it for batteries, because it's like, that's such a physical thing. Like, you're using a bunch of oil to mine stuff. And like, there are reasons to look at the supply chain and think, oh, this can be shrunk, but not that, oh, this is going to go down by another factor of 10.
Okay,
Like
this is an argument I've made before. I have a slide I've used sometimes, and I show a floppy disk from 30 years ago, and I say this was $3 and it held 128K. Now for $5, you can buy a little memory stick that holds a million times that, 5 gigabytes. But your car battery hasn't shrunk. It's a little better, but the car battery is basically what it was, because it's a chemical thing. And you don't find chemical processes shrinking. You don't see refineries shrinking. You don't see petrochemical plants shrinking. That's just the science of it. And so when, frankly, people like Al Gore sort of go, well, look at the cell phones, why can't we do that with car batteries? And the answer is because it's chemistry. You can't make chemical processes thousands of times more efficient.
Yeah, another thing that's related to what you said is, like, I'm very skeptical of a lot of these numbers. So one thing is, we know that the automakers are having losses on these EVs. So there's a question of, what do these batteries even cost? And there's all these different kinds of incentives. And then if you look at something like, a Tesla Powerwall, so people will say, oh, well, it's getting close to $100 a kilowatt hour, but I think that's around $700 a kilowatt hour. Right?
I actually just looked that up last week, and I found you could buy it for $800 a kilowatt hour.
I don't think it's gone down that much in price. I don't think it certainly hasn't gone down by a factor of 4 or something.
No, and part of it is people are mixing apples and oranges and oak trees and acorns. They'll talk about sort of what GM has to pay to buy battery cells in huge quantities. But then the battery pack is more expensive than the individual cells. And if you're buying them as a person or buying them in a car, the price goes up that much more. You're paying retail. It's just I'm still trying to nail down exactly what the prices are. And I found so many different numbers out there. And also so many different numbers for what the price needs to be for the cars to be competitive. And that's part of the problem is there's so many people, so many advocates for electric vehicles who'll just pick a number that they saw on the internet and they'll repeat it endlessly. And everybody thinks that's the real number. And the number I've seen most often is $100 per kilowatt hour. I can't find the source of that, and other things I've seen suggest that no, that's still too high, and that the prices are still well above that right now.
Yeah, and again, there is this sloppiness where it's not clear. Okay, is that just the core of the battery? Is that the actual functioning battery pack? Is that something you're delivering to a car? Is that with the consumer? And we don't make those mistakes with oil because we're really clear on, oh, this is what a barrel of oil costs. And this is what gasoline costs. And there's not nearly that transparency with batteries.
Right, because I mean, you could say so. Oil in the ground is a third the price, the value of oil above ground because you have to produce it over time. So it's a discounting thing. But you'll occasionally see people say, "Oh, somebody bought a billion barrel oil field for $3 billion. Aha, $3 is the price." Like, no, that's not the real price. It is, and again, it's partly because there's just so much interest and so many people without economic backgrounds who just trust. This is a Tom Nichols book, The Death of Expertise. He says so many people think because they read something on the internet and they like it, that makes them an expert because they now have knowledge, when in fact they don't realize how much junk is out there on the internet.
Yeah, although a lot of the I use the term a lot in my new book, designated experts. Like the designated experts in our society do not have a great track record, particularly when there's a big moral movement that they're part of to, get off something or get on something. And in this case, it has both of those components.
Yeah, you mentioned Avery Lumrance before. This is a guy who's won every award in the book, mostly from environmental organizations. And, he was a guy early on who said, we can be more efficient in our energy use. And people laughed at him back in the 70s, and he turned out to be right in that sense. But since then, he's essentially promoted gold-plated solutions that people just don't want. And yet, because they like his message, he's still considered this big guru. And, I debated him once in Washington and with his report, Winning the Oiled Endgame. And I raised a bunch of, what I thought were compelling objections. And he just refused to respond. So, the moderator asked him to respond to my criticisms. And he said, well, let's talk about the instability in the Middle East instead.
Is that recorded, that debate?
No, I don't think so. This was at the National Defense University about 12 years ago, I think.
Oh man, so many of the best things are not recorded. That's why I record everything.
I tell you, there was another debate where there was a Nobel Prize winning physicist who said, well, he read that oil supply is peaking and we have a climate change problem, and he had the solution: solar power stations on the moon. And the people in the audience choked a little bit, and somebody said, I think that's beyond our budget. And he said, oh, no, it's free because all the materials are on the moon. You don't need to lift them out of orbit. And that was not recorded, but his name was Roy Smalley. He's passed away then. But, it's one of those things where, yeah, you could do it technically, but just as you could technically power a car with Mentos and Diet Coke, but nobody does it because, it's technically feasible, but that's all.
Yeah. I mean, there's almost this is actually the section of the book I was editing today. People just value technical achievement and do not value economic achievement. So this idea, oh, well, we could send a man to the moon, so of course we can change our whole energy system. It's like, no, the equivalent would be sending every man to the moon.
That's a brilliant analogy. Yes. Good, Alex. I can't wait to see your book.
Oh, okay, good. Well, I'll send you a copy when it's done.
Okay, I'll review it for you.
Oh, awesome. That would be great. So let's talk about, so the thing that concerns me most about EVs is while they're not as cost effective as gasoline vehicles, they're not so far from cost effective like a kind of Mark Jacobson hydrogen powered plane type, like made up crank idea.
Yeah.
That what I'm wary of is that they have significant progress mandating them and just really hurting the poorest people and middle class people most of all. And to support that, we've got all these mandates now. And so I'm curious what you think of how these like it seems like these mandates can sort of work more than like mandating a hydrogen plane, which just it wouldn't work at all, or cellulosic ethanol, like it doesn't work and then you scrap it. What do you think of these mandates and what they portend?
I, I don't think I've ever met a mandate I liked. That includes from my wife. Don't tell her I said that. But
Okay.
yeah,
I think she's a regular viewer of Power Hour.
probably not. She teaches languages. She doesn't care about economics. Um, the a mandate is like saying this doesn't work. We have to force people to buy it. And it's also saying we're going to disguise the costs by making the bigger system like a utility buy a small amount of the very expensive stuff and then press the cost onto all of their customers so that it's not so noticeable. Or in the case of electric vehicles, it's subsidies the taxpayers are paying for, rich people to buy electric vehicles. And there's increasing complaints that both renewables like solar and wind and battery electric vehicles are essentially a tax on the poor to support the upper middle class. And I think it's very valid. And I think especially when we start to look after the pandemic and say, gee, there's so much debt out there. And then people say, okay, but all this stuff is really cheap. You're going to have to give us a lot of money for it. I think there'll be some more serious consideration and opposition to some of these subsidies and mandates. The Californians tried mandating the battery electric vehicle back in the 90s, and a lot of states like Massachusetts, New England, generally signed on to that. And the idea was, well, you can force the technology, and it didn't work. There's a great book, The Car That Could, which came out just after the GM's EV1 appeared on the market, and the author didn't realize it was going to be a complete failure. But he describes all the problems they've had to face just to get even a really inferior product to market. And in the end, I think Alan Lloyd at the Air Resources Board in California, he said, look, it's not my job to promote electric vehicles. It's my job to promote clean air. So a mandate for electric vehicles answers the question, how do we get people to buy electric vehicles? It doesn't answer the question, how do we get people to reduce emissions? And a lot of people have pointed out that, you're only reducing emissions by 30, 40, 50%. Depending on your power source. And even if you have a lot of renewable or zero emission power like nuclear, making the car and making the batteries takes a lot of energy and involves a lot of emissions. So it's actually one of the most expensive ways out there to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. There's one chart McKinsey did some years ago showing all the different costs, and they don't even include electric vehicles because they're off the scale.
Yeah, I found that was a good fact from the article. So let's see what else. What about just with EVs, the fact that they need electricity, and right now we're having difficulty providing electricity for a world where it's 2% EVs.
This is a real problem, and again, it's the sort of thing where I think people haven't seriously considered the technical challenges, and that's what we're seeing in places like California, Texas with the renewables now. They just kind of wave around. I mean, I love, people would say, you have high air conditioning use in the middle of the day and you have high solar power, so there's no problem. Well, it turns out they don't overlap exactly, so you need to ramp up a lot of natural gas power in California. People said, it's people will recharge their cars at home at night when the power demand is low. Well, yeah, but you also have less solar power, less wind power at night. So, especially solar, obviously.
Yeah, a lot less.
Oh, by the way, I have to send you there's an article where somebody suggested a solar powered tank for NATO, which is just about as it's the funniest thing I've seen. But anyway, yeah, it's not clear what it means for the grid if you have a lot more of these cars, and you don't know when people are going to charge them, because supposedly a lot of offices will have free charging stations in the future, and then all of a sudden you're adding to your daytime load instead of your nighttime load, and I don't think people have factored that in. So you're sort of saying, let's do all these different things to sort of improve emissions slightly at a huge cost. And you got to say, well, surely there's something else we could do. Plant trees. Personally, I'm very much in favor of going out to the third world and giving people propane so they don't have to chop down trees for cooking. I think that's something you would approve of.
Yeah, I mean, that's made a huge demonstrable difference in a lot of places. India, Tanzania. It's amazing how transformative it is and how little interest there is from most mainstream entities.
Yeah, and I was in Africa a few years ago, and all the Europeans were talking about solar power for villages in Africa, and all the Africans were talking about power access and energy poverty, and it was a real disconnect. And I keep having the problem that this stuff sounds great if you're rich or if you can get somebody else to pay for it, but the battery electric vehicle, if you look at the few models where you have a gasoline power and a option or electric option, it's $8,000, $10,000, $12,000 difference. It's just a lot of money, and and again, why should the taxpayers be having to pay for this, since you're not getting bus drivers going out there buying Teslas?
Yeah, for sure. Let me just see. Okay, I just want to make sure I look over my list of questions and don't forget any, and then regret it. Well, let's talk about. So one of the arguments that EVs and these and in general oil uses, EVs are going to increase, oil use is going to decline precipitously as well. Now we have changing attitudes, like we're more environmentally conscious. So we addressed that. Actually, we addressed that a little bit with SUVs. What about this argument that, well, we're not going to want much mobility and material stuff anymore post-pandemic because we've discovered the joys of not moving during the pandemic?
And this is something where, first, you have to understand the pandemic is an unusual event. It's a transient, and people have a tendency to sort of say, aha, now everything will be different. And I've been hearing that my whole life, and things never change. But also, you definitely seen the internet has reduced in-store retail shopping somewhat, but a lot less than people expected. It has not reduced business travel significantly. People thought after September 11th that people would be afraid to fly. That hasn't happened. You're still seeing the same amount of car highway use that keeps going up. The miles traveled in this country go up year after year, and plane travel goes up year after year, especially internationally. It's really hard to find evidence of people opting for the simpler lifestyle. I used to joke, there used to be a bumper sticker that said, "Live simply so others may live." And I said, okay, live simply so I can have more stuff.
Nice. Oh, here's a question I forgot. What I want to talk about the batteries and other things. What are, in your research, what have you seen about the scaling challenges? Because people talk about we're going to use 50 times more of this, and they don't seem to think, oh, that might present some challenges with different kinds of raw materials involved.
That's the thing. It's a myth that rare earth minerals are actually rare. There are a lot of them, but they are expensive. They're dirty to produce. They are energy intensive to produce. A lot of the stuff is produced in places that are, shall we say, not socially acceptable. Teenagers in the Congo digging mines, that kind of thing. And although in theory you could increase the production of those things to a huge degree, but if you talk about ramping it up quickly, I think you're just going to have a lot of problems, local pollution problems, and a certain amount of dependence where you're vulnerable to, say, now China for some of these materials, but also, like I say, the Congo is a big supplier. So, it'd be great if there were big lithium deposits in West Virginia and the coal miners could just switch over, but that's not going to happen.
Well, there are lithium deposits in the U.S., but it's not, the Biden administration isn't clamoring to increase mining.
Yeah, I think if they do that, hell will freeze over. Well, actually, I guess we're pretty close to that with Texas now.
Yeah, that's right. It's the world is so warm, but it's still too cold.
Yeah.
Okay. this is a question I have that's only tangentially related, but I need it for my own research. So I'll ask you, like, what's the best research we have on the state of hydrocarbon deposits in the world? So when people are estimating how much oil and gas and coal there is in place, like leaving aside economics, what are the best estimates we have, and where do we get those?
Well, I had them in my book, actually, which is 5 years old now. Boy, time flies. So if you talk about conventional oil, the we've used about 1 trillion barrels throughout all of history, a little bit more. The amount in place is about 12 trillion, of which right now about 4 trillion could be recovered. If you talk about heavy oil and oil sands, there's probably another 10 trillion, of which maybe 1.5 to 2 trillion is currently recoverable. If you talk about shale oil, that number is a lot fuzzier, but it's probably, again, about 10 trillion in place, of which maybe half a trillion to a trillion is now recoverable. And that assumes a very low recovery rate. And then there's kerogen, which is shale, that's rock that you have to break up and process. And so that's another maybe 10 to 12 trillion. So, so essentially we've used about 3% of the world's petroleum resource. And the people who think that we were running out just seem to be unaware that the estimates they were getting were saying, ignore all this stuff that's a little expensive or a little hard to produce because we don't need it now. So what we have right now is, another 300 or 400 years worth, another 3 trillion barrels, 4 trillion that can be produced cheaply.
What about natural gas?
Oh God, natural gas. Sorry, I'm getting my halo. Natural gas is super abundant. There's a lot more than petroleum. There are unconventional deposits, clathrates or methane hydrates, where a type of crystal that forms under slightly cold, slight pressure, but you find it all over the world to the point where, you have thousands and thousands of years of the resource. Now, the methane hydrates are expensive to produce now, but people are experimenting in new ways to recover them. And the thing is, because you find them in seafloors pretty much all over the world, but also places like Alaska, fairly shallow, Siberia. But then, if the Japanese can figure out how to make them a bit cheaper and they think they're getting closer, then all of a sudden they've got all the natural gas they want without having to import it.
And what about coal?
Coal, coal, there's more than you would ever want to produce. And, I come from a West Virginian family, and we still, I think, have some coal rights somewhere up in the mountains, but I'm not a big fan of coal, except where, the next best thing is dried dung or something, which is unfortunately the case in many places. But it is thought that, the world has easily 400 or 500 years of coal reserves. And especially if you're seeing coal backed out by natural gas more and more around the world, which is kind of happening, except China and India, then, you don't have a problem with the coal supply.
Gotcha. All right. Well, I got to go reread that portion of the book, or maybe I'll email you because I got to get all those references. But
I'll check the chapter and mention it to you.
I appreciate that. And then final question is, what are you mentioned this a little bit, but what are the most exciting technologies on the horizon? Because one thing people don't think about with resources is they always think of it as stagnant. So they use reserves in the lowest reserve. So that's like presently planned production, and they equate that with potential. Mm-hmm. And of course, we have we're continuously, not me, but people in industry are continuously innovating. So what do you see as the most exciting technologies now and on the horizon in terms of hydrocarbons?
In terms of hydrocarbons, there's work going on, people trying to come up with using recombinant DNA to modify bacteria to improve recovery of oil deposits, especially, but heavy oil and so forth. And that conceivably could extend, the existing resource base quite a bit. Nanotechnology, I don't think is there yet, but it has some applications. Supercapacitors maybe will turn out to be a much better battery than anything we have now, but I don't think that's near. I think the main thing is people are doing a lot of work on carbon capture, which is a fairly new field, and nobody cared about it. I mean, why would you do that except when you wanted to insert CO2 into an oil field? But there are a number of people saying, we think we've come up with ways. There's a guy who says if you have a gas-fired plant, if you burn the methane in pure oxygen, you get a pure CO2 stream, and then you can just pump that into the ground. So you basically, he says it's very cheap. You can have a zero emission natural gas-fired plant, and that would mean you could you wouldn't have to build solar or wind. You could build natural gas plants everywhere, and you wouldn't be adding to the carbon emissions.
Who is this?
I'll send you a link. I have to look him up again. He's down in, I think, Alabama somewhere. He's a serious guy. He's got money for it. And also I think small modular reactors, nuclear reactors, and there are people, serious people like at MIT and Lockheed, who say they think they can make a fusion reactor roughly the size of a tractor trailer, because there's been so much advance in both software for controlling a fusion reaction and the materials, and that would give you, I'm not going to say electricity too cheap to meter, because that's been said and laughed at many times, but that could turn out to work out very well. I personally think, I'd like to see a lot more use of LNG around the world, where you can take a barge-loaded power plant to a port in, Haiti or West Africa or something, and you can bring in a floating storage unit for LNG, and just have a tanker sitting there instead of building something on land, and you can have power and have that done fairly quickly. And that's starting to grow now, and that's more on the usage side, but it definitely could help to provide power to a lot of places that need it.
Yeah, and it'd be great to do that with a nuclear submarine or something like that. I mean, but it is very exciting to just think like that's a real kind of innovation that most of these quote innovations make no sense to me, but the ability to just float a power plant over, so you don't have to build it on land, and probably has more security too, and you probably is easier to charge for it, which is an issue in a lot of poor countries. It's very intriguing.
And if you then build bigger units on shore or something, you can just sell the barge and sail it away to somebody else who needs it.
Yeah, it's cool. So yeah, it's good that there are really exciting things in energy, I think, generated by free people under competitive markets. And then there are a lot of non-exciting things that people want to force down our throats. So he's mostly been talking about the latter, but it's good to talk about the first. Mike, where can people learn more about you and follow you?
Okay. I blog on Forbes.com. Energy Seer, one word, ENERGYSEER.com is my website, although I don't do a lot with that. And I put up research reports on the Energy Policy Research Foundation, EPRINC.org in Washington. That's where the latest report we've been discussing, it's up on the website there.
All right, Mike, thanks so much for being on the call.
No, it's good to see you, Alex.
All right. All right. Thanks again to Michael Lynch for joining me. As always, if you have any questions, comments, love mail, or hate mail, you can email me at alex@alexepstein.com. Since I already did another episode this week, I won't do too much of a wrap up, but I would just say go check my Twitter account, twitter.com/alexepstein. You can see my ultra popular post explaining the Texas electricity crisis like nothing else. All right. I'll be back next week with another great guest. Until then, I'm Alex Epstein. This has been Power Hour.
Power Hour. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of energy. Power Hour. The antidote to shallow thinking about energy issues.